The prefect of the Seine was a man incapable of treason. And had he been in the way when the soldiers arrived, he certainly would not have admitted them until he had properly investigated the business. But who could have supposed that whole troops would have left their quarters, headed by their officers, without any orders from their generals, and above all for the object they had in view? The prefect of the Seine was universally commiserated. His friends did not desert him, and the emperor expressed his regret for what had happened. Indeed, the emperor particularly esteemed him, but for the obstinacy of the Duc de Feltre, I am certain that the prefect of the Seine would not have been dismissed. If he should read these memoirs, I am happy to be enabled to inform him that when conversing with me respecting this affair on board the Bellerophon, the emperor spoke of him with a degree of interest bordering on friendship. Thus ended the extraordinary enterprise of Melee. Nothing could exceed the art and boldness with which it was managed. Everyone was surprised at it, while they acknowledged its weakness, and though they were ashamed of it, it did not render them any the wiser. It excited great alarm in Paris, because people found that they were still on a volcano, while they had long fancied themselves on a rock. The war minister attempted to justify the troops, and in so doing he called in question the vigilance of the minister of police. But even supposing the latter had it in his power to trace a single thread of this conspiracy, which was known to one man only, nothing could excuse the troops for turning against the existing authority. Men of the most ordinary capacity are always expected to understand this part of their duty. The minister for the War Department made a great noise on this occasion, and he sent the horse guards to St. Cloud under pretense that Malay's party wanted to carry off the emperor's son, while Malay and his companions were already under arrest. All that the war minister did was useless, and he knew it, but he wanted to show his zeal, to ingratiate himself in public opinion, and to avert the storm which he saw gathering. He made a great parade when the danger was over, and in so doing he gained his end. The details of the trial did not set his mind at ease, and he was not satisfied until he sent an officer of his staff to the emperor. He took his judgment by surprise in this affair, and completely misled him. The emperor afterwards discovered this, but he had pronounced his decision, and he did not wish to show that he had been deceived. However, the war minister was no gainer in this business. For my part, I sent no one to the emperor. I did not wish to take his judgment by surprise, or to accuse any person whatever, and I even made up my mind to bear all that I foresaw he would write to me on the subject. He had often spoken to me sharply, but I had never been accustomed to receive a harsh letter from him. Accordingly, I calculated the day in which I might expect to receive from the emperor a reply to the report of the event. On that day, I made my secretary open all the letters which came from the emperor, and I ordered him to give me only those which contained no expression of humor, and to throw the reprimand, if one should be sent into the fire. It arrived as I expected, and nothing was wanting but to have deserved it. However, I did not vex myself, because I knew all that had been done to influence the opinion of the emperor. It always placed confidence in his judgment and goodness of heart, and I would not have run the chance of losing his favor for having failed in such a circumstance. I suffered from the consequences of this affair. Many persons deserted me because they were persuaded I could not remain in place. They even went so far as to choose a successor for me. Said the ladies, they should watch what is going on in the barracks rather than in our boudoirs. In all ages of the world, a defeated party has invariably paid the penalty. But in this instance, had I been somewhat less conscientious than I was, I might have cleared myself at the expense of another. This was a fine opportunity for avenging the discovery made in the offices of the War Department of the espionage of the Russian embassy, and it was not suffered to escape. Some months after, I might have had a triumphant satisfaction, and will be seen in the course of these memoirs, but I let the matter pass. I was pitied, for I had gained the good opinion of the public, and I had done no harm to anyone, but on the contrary had been serviceable to many. People expressed regret for what had happened to me, but they believed, nevertheless, that the first courier from the emperor would announce the nomination of my successor. They therefore behaved accordingly, and intrigues commenced for sharing my spoil. I pretended not to observe them, while I profited by the opportunity of knowing my friends. Chapter 6. During the end of October, we supposed that the emperor would pass the winter in Moscow, but we soon received bulletins announcing the retreat of the army and the events which occasioned that retreat. The Russians, having sacrificed Moscow, would listen to no proposal for an armistice. They had a good position at Kaluga. Our communications could not possibly be maintained. The enemy's light troops left nothing but burnt villages to ours. They were surrounding Moscow, and our army would have been enclosed there in ignorance of all that was passing behind it, where there was still a force sufficient to form a powerful army. Privation had caused disorder in the corps, to which distributions could not be made. These and many other considerations determined the emperor to retreat. He was very dissatisfied that our cavalry had not observed the track of the Russians. Had he known the course they took, he might have followed and dispersed them after the battle of Moskva instead of preceding the Moscow. The whole population of Paris had provided themselves with maps of Russia, on which they were tracing with pins the places mentioned in the bulletins. All classes of society evinced the utmost eagerness to obtain intelligence of an army in which everyone had a brother, a son, or a friend. The distance which the army had to march to find winter quarters excited the most serious alarm, which, as the fatal 29th bulletin speedily showed, was but too well founded. The emperor's arrival in Paris was a death blow to public confidence. Gloomy forebodings having once commenced, they were carried on beyond all bounds, and the French army was regarded as an immense caravan of men frozen and starving instead of that mass of brave cohorts which had so long been the admiration of contemporaries and had performed so many deeds of glory to adorn the pages of history. The public mind was in this state of restless anxiety when intelligence was received of the arrival at Vilna of the wreck of our army. It had lost all its horses and consequently all its artillery, and had returned to the Beresina successfully cut off and flanked by the corps of the Russian army, which had left Kaluga to intercept the road from Smolensk to Moscow. On reaching the Beresina, the left bank of the river was found to be occupied by the Russian army, which had come from Moldavia after the Treaty of Jassy. This unexpected circumstance destroyed the remaining hope of the wreck of our army. The emperor could not understand why Prince Schwarzenberg and General Renier had not secured him against the march of this Russian force. There was no alternative but to engage it, and fortune granted only a few moments for opening the passage of the Beresina before the arrival of the other Russian army, which was following the rear of the column on his departure from Moscow. The emperor had foreseen all that the army must suffer in passing through a country which had already been ravaged by the successive marches of two such considerable armies. Thus, on quitting Moscow, he took the road to Kaluga through a country which had not previously been occupied and in which the army would have found subsistence, but the Russians had got before him. He attacked and beat them, but could not put them to the rout. They retired to Maloyaroslavets. Unfortunately, the emperor was not informed of this. He thought that he could not dislodge them from their position except by means of combinations which he had not time to employ. He fell back on Moyaisk. The Russians returned to occupy the positions they had abandoned, and then our misfortunes commenced. The army at length reached the Beresina. The bridges of the Borisov were destroyed. The enemy was waiting for us on the opposite bank, and our destruction seemed inevitable. But the emperor watched over the wreck of his army. Wittgenstein's corps was penetrated, and the places which seemed distant as the scenes of our defeat witnessed the flight of those who might have conquered us. We crossed the fatal river, but cold, privation, and fatigue continued to ravage us. We had no alternative but to face the disasters which menaced us, and which the emperor measured in their fullest extent. He knew the sentiments that were entertained for us in Germany, and the hopes which our reverses would revive. He resolved to anticipate them, and at least to ensure himself the means of repressing them, another consideration contributed to determine him. He had just learned the details of Malay's affair, and in spite of the accounts he had received, all of which varied according to the opinions of the rivalry or the ambition of those by whom they were related, the truth had not escaped him. His excellent tact enabled him to see the affair in its true light and to estimate the danger better than anyone, not by what Malay had done, but by what had not been done, by those who possessed his confidence in the different departments of the government. Melancholy reflections arose in his mind when he discovered that his system had not attained that degree of solidity which he thought he had imparted to it. This consideration contributed not a little to hasten his return to Paris, where he naturally supposed that the intelligence of the disaster of the army would spread alarm. He arrived on the 19th of December at 8 in the evening, and the ministers were summoned to attend him at 10 o'clock next morning. I went to see Monsieur Caulaincourt on the evening of the 19th. He informed me of the utter ruin of all at Moscow. He had just passed a fortnight in intimate communication with the emperor, who, he said, had read over 20 times all the accounts he had received respecting the affair of the 23rd of October. Monsieur Caulaincourt did not disguise from me that though the emperor set down a great deal to the account of animosity, yet he was nevertheless somewhat displeased with me. He thought my defense feeble, and he concluded that there was reason for its being so. I was not sorry to learn that the emperor was a little out of humor, because by a clear and natural statement it was always easy to make him see the truth. And then people who had been calumniated stood higher in his good opinion than before. The emperor had conversed with the aide-de-camp whom the Duc de Feltre had sent to him, and he returned home with the impression he had received from the account of the war minister. Caulaincourt did his best to serve me, for which I am indebted to him. Next day, the 20th of December, the emperor's saloons were thronged at an early hour, but the persons who assembled there were not all equally satisfied. The emperor first received the arch-chancellor, and then the ministers, one after another, according to their seniority in office, so that the grand judge and all the others, the minister of commerce excepted, preceded me. Among all who were there, not one would have chosen to be in my place. They seemed as if they did not dare to speak to me, for fear of giving me pain. The emperor did not detain any of the ministers long, except the Duc de Feltre, so that I was soon introduced. As I passed through the crowd, which was collected round the door of the emperor's saloon, everyone fell back, as if to make way for a funeral procession. All thought I was bidding adieu to the court, and what tended to confirm this opinion was that the Duke of Otranto had returned to Paris, the emperor having recalled him from Aix in Provence, where he resided. He was already looked upon as my successor. Some friends of my former prosperity did not fail to acquaint me with all that was said while I was with the emperor. My audience lasted nearly 2 hours, and the time was accurately calculated by observers who were not all so well disposed towards me as the arch-chancellor, who remained in the saloon till I took my leave. The emperor asked me 1,000 questions respecting the affairs of the interior. Previous to Malay's conspiracy, I had none but good accounts to give him of the truth, of which he himself had an opportunity of judging on his journey from Metz to Paris. He was therefore very well satisfied, especially as I said ill of nobody. It never seemed to be understood in France that the emperor was always best pleased when he heard no complaints against any person whatever. When he had made all the inquiries he wished, he commenced the subject of Malay. He spoke first, and from all he said I sufficiently understood whence he had obtained his information. Some degree of malignity had been employed, for the facts pointed out to him were all well known, but pains had been taken to prejudice his judgment, and that object had been gained. He said to me, that you might be arrested by 50 men, I can very well understand. For your own sake, it would have been well if you could have defended yourself. I am myself at the mercy of the officer who was on duty at my door, but I cannot understand how it happened that you were not aware that Malay and the colonel of the cohort had been for some time in the habit of seeing each other, as well as Laurie. His notion of the affair was founded entirely upon the intelligence he had received from the military police. I pointed out the incorrectness of these statements and acquainted him with the facts which I have already laid before the reader. At first, he would not believe what I told him, and he said, "Can any man in his senses tell me such a story as this?" I persisted in my statement, and he began to be convinced when I informed him that the colonel of the 10th cohort had been only a few days in Paris, and he had just returned from Barcelona, where he had distinguished himself, which had obtained for him the command of that cohort, and that not only he had not given cartridges to his men, but that he had not made them put their flints in their muskets, which he would not have neglected if he had had any share in the plot. This had not been mentioned in the report of the military police. The emperor was still of opinion that General Lamotte had been concerned in Malay's enterprise. He reflected on me for not having concurred with the minister of the War Department who had arrested General Lamotte and kept him still in prison. To this I replied by the observations which I made a few pages farther back. The emperor would not admit the justice of my opinion until he had submitted it to the council, and he said, "If this be true, you have viewed the affair in its true light." The war minister had not spoken to him of Adjutant General Doucet, who had tampered with Malay instead of hastening to the aid of General Hulan. On the contrary, he created him a general brigade, which caused it to be said that Doucet could not fail to attain that rank, for Malay had already given it to him. The emperor never spoke to me with greater kindness than on this occasion. He only regretted that I had not been able to defend myself. "It is a vexatious affair," he said, "but you were not to blame." He also asked how it had happened that the conspirators got access to me without encountering any guards in my antechambers. "One musket shot," he said, "could have put the whole troop to flight." This was true enough, but it was necessary first to have one's hands free. Laurice and I took this precaution because he knew I was not likely to allow myself to be seized without resistance. Finally, I observed, "I have a guard of 8 or 10 men only during the night. In the daytime they withdraw," and they were just gone when the 3 companies of the cohort arrived. He said nothing about the guard at my door seeing my office broken into and suffering me to be arrested without making any resistance. I saw that he was beginning to take a right view of the affair, and he dismissed me, desiring that I would send Monsieur de Rial to him that evening, and he wished to speak to him. When I quitted the emperor, it was curious to observe the eagerness with which the courtiers tried to read in my countenance whether they ought or ought not to speak to me. However, they augured favorably of an interview of such long duration, and from that evening, for it was between 4 and 5 before the emperor dismissed me, the absurd reports of which I had been the subject for the space of a month were at an end. I subsequently had many good opportunities of punishing the author of these stories, but I let them pass. When I was restored to favor, my friends returned to me. I received them all without cherishing ill will towards any. The emperor appeared to me to be offended with Monsieur Pasquier, the prefect of police. I took his part and obtained for him the justice he deserved. This was no very difficult task, for Monsieur Pasquier was a great favorite with the emperor. The emperor held a council to deliberate on the affair of General Malay. He ordered a report to be presented to him of all the circumstances of the case, and on this he formed an accurate opinion. He ordered the liberation of General Lamotte, but he dismissed the prefect of the Seine in spite of all I could say in his behalf. And finally, he disbanded the paid horse and foot guards of the city of Paris. He ordered me to present to him in the same council a plan for organizing a corps of gendarmerie for Paris, which was to be subordinate both to the civil and military authorities, so that there might be no reason to apprehend the bad use that either the one or the other might make of it. On the same day, intelligence was received of the defense of the castle of Burgos, which had sustained several assaults from the English without losing any of its works in the garrison by which it was defended. There was a detachment of the paid guard of Paris. The war minister proposed that the emperor should reform out of this detachment the corps which had been disbanded in Paris. But the emperor would not hear of this, and he directed me to draw up without delay the plan he had ordered. Chapter 7. The disastrous Russian campaign was the first fatal event with which France had been visited during the emperor's reign. It was endured with courage, though it was much talked of, and every sacrifice was generously made for the necessity of reorganizing the army. At this period, we began to experience the levying of taxes by illegal means, and some other measures equally arbitrary were also put in force. But the embarrassments of our situation at that moment rendered them necessary. Our misfortunes were great, and the time for repairing them was short, so that it was requisite to proceed with the utmost promptitude. It would be severe injustice to judge the emperor by the 2 last years of his reign. They furnished arms to his enemies, but we must not imitate them. The events of these 2 last years were beyond human foresight, and they demanded remedies out of the regular course, and only those were adopted which could be most readily put in force. Had not arbitrary measures been resorted to, we should not have been enabled again to take the field as we did in the month of May following. None but the emperor could have turned to such good account the resources he possessed and created those he wanted. All our convoys of arms and baggage had been left in the canals of Prussia and in the rivers of Poland, where they were frozen up. The emperor had to replace the whole of the artillery with trains. He had all the cavalry to remount and half his infantry to renew. Such a situation would have daunted any courage but his. However, when he had carefully read the returns and reports which showed it, as he said, what his situation was, he set to work, and in a very few weeks he had collected the materials of a new army. The artillery was in the arsenal, so that all that remained to be done was to purchase horses and equip them. A sufficient number was procured for the trains and also for remounting the cavalry. The works for the supply of everything connected with the military service were doubled, and in this department everything still went on well. The 100 cohorts of the National Guard, together with all the troops who were in the depots of the different regiments, were incorporated with the army. To these were added a levy of men, and thus an army was formed no less numerous than the first, with which, however, it was not to be compared as far as regarded the figure, and above all the experience of the men. The emperor appointed to each of his new battalions old officers from the corps of the army, but as this operation had already been several times repeated, those officers were themselves nothing more than good privates. For the class from which picked men used to be taken was already exhausted. The cavalry in particular was composed merely of boys mounted on horses, as raw and untrained as their riders. The marine proved of great assistance in this emergency, for it gave its corps of artillery, which was very numerous, and compensated over and above for the losses which had been sustained in that department. The marine, moreover, furnished a fine division of infantry. The national feeling was enthusiastic throughout France. The people of Piedmont also distinguished themselves for the zeal with which they anticipated all that could be required of them. Deputations arrived from all parts of France, with assurances of loyalty and attachment to the emperor. Amidst the misfortunes with which we were assailed, all seemed to derive consolation from the opportunity of evincing their zeal. All classes vied with each other in their exertions for the public service. Patriotic contributions were never more willingly made at any period of the revolution. That feeling pervaded all classes of society, and every corporation and profession supplied a certain number of horses and war equipages. While the emperor was thus exerting himself in Paris, ruin awaited his affairs in the army. The king of Naples had not only failed in rallying the army at Vilna, but he had evacuated that town and brought back the army in confusion towards the Vistula. This completed our destruction in Russia. It was the month of January, and the cold was excessive. On reaching the Vistula, the king of Naples himself quitted the army to return to his own dominions, transferring the command to the viceroy of Italy. The emperor was very dissatisfied with this conduct, and it was well for the king of Naples that he did not pass through France, where he would certainly have met with a very unfavorable reception. He proceeded home by way of Saxony, Bavaria, and the Tyrol. The Russians dispatched hosts of Cossacks in pursuit of our army. They crossed the rivers on the ice, so that we could not take up a position anywhere. We consequently fell back on Posen and afterwards on the Oder and the Elbe, but we could not guard even the latter river. The Prussian contingent under the command of General York was on the left of Marshal MacDonald's corps. The Prussian general made a treaty in favor of his corps with the Russian general who was pursuing him. He concluded an armistice by which his troops were neutralized, thus exposing the rest of the army corps to certain destruction. By this means, he indirectly compromised the King of Prussia, his master, who was in his capital in the midst of our army. At the time of this first defection, we felt the full weight of the ingratitude of Marshal Bernadotte, who might, by attacking Finland, have detained the corps which he had allowed to enter Kurland. The union of the Swedes with the Russian army happened very inopportunely for us, as it took place at the very moment when the other allied sovereigns were directing their extraordinary ambassadors to renew assurances of their friendly sentiments towards the emperor. The King of Prussia disavowed any participation in the conduct of his general. He sent an ambassador to the emperor in the month of January, and General York was condemned by a court-martial. But such was the rapid course of events that in less than 3 months after he was in the ranks of our enemies, the king long resisted the entreaties with which he was assailed in Prussia to join the Russians. The natural sincerity of his character kept him firm to our alliance in spite of the fatal results which it could not fail to draw upon him. He was driven to the determination he adopted by men of restless spirit, who told him plainly but respectfully that they were ready to act either with him or without him. Well, gentlemen, replied the king, you force me to this course, but recollect, we must either conquer or be annihilated. When the emperor learned the defection of the Prussian corps, he summoned a privy council at which were present the Arch-Chancellor, Mr. de Talleyrand, the ministers, the President of the Senate, and several of the grand officers of the household. The Emperor himself explained the situation of affairs, read the dispatches which announced the defection of the Prussian corps, and then proposed the following question for the consideration of the council. In this conjecture, which greatly increases the difficulty of our situation, do you advise me to negotiate for peace or to make new exertions to continue the war? For my part, I was sorry to see this question submitted to the judgment of so many individuals. It ought to have been discussed in the emperor's cabinet by 2 or 3 persons called in one after another. Numerous councils have the disadvantage of never coming to any determination, because nobody will venture to pronounce a bold opinion. Thus, in the present instance, all were inclined to remain silent. The emperor asked the Arch-Chancellor his opinion. He declared for peace. But the emperor was in the habit of amusing himself with all the opinions of Cambacérès, except on questions of legislation and jurisprudence. He next addressed himself to Monsieur de Talleyrand, who did not reply with the frankness and decision I expected from him. Whether he did not choose to speak out before so many persons or had some other motive for silence, he merely recommended a negotiation. The emperor observed, "This is always your way. You go about everywhere saying that we must make peace. But how is peace to be made?" Monsieur de Talleyrand replied, "Your Majesty has still negotiable means in your hands. If you delay longer and should happen to lose them, you will then be unable to negotiate." The emperor, getting somewhat impatient, said, "Explain yourself." But seeing that Monsieur de Talleyrand hesitated, he added, "I see you are still the same." Then, turning suddenly to the Duc de Feltre, though there were 2 or 3 persons between him and Talleyrand, he asked his opinion on the question proposed. After a pause, Monsieur de Feltre replied in a firm tone, "I shall consider your Majesty dishonored if you consent to abandon a single village which has been united to France by a senatus consultum." "That is clear," said the emperor. "But then what is to be done?" "We must arm, sire," replied Monsieur de Feltre. The emperor then proceeded to collect the other votes, but no one was disposed to express an opinion different from that which appeared so agreeable to him. Monsieur de Feltre thought that he had fixed the opinion of the council, but he labored under a mistake, and he must have been convinced, as well as I, when the council broke up, how much every member in his private opinion disapproved the rejection of Monsieur de Talleyrand's advice. The emperor had good reason to say that when he called on everyone for his opinion, nobody would speak out, but that when they separated, they all blamed him for what he had said. It was then determined at this council that we should arm to the utmost extent the string of the bow was already well stretched, and it certainly would have broken in any other hands than in those of the emperor. We were soon after informed of the participation of Sweden in the coalition, as well as of the result of the interview between the Emperor of Russia and the King of Prussia, the latter having gone from Berlin to Brezov to meet Alexander. At Brezov, the King of Prussia renewed all the treaties which existed between him and the autocrat before the unfortunate war which Prussia waged against France in 1806-1807. This defection of the whole of Prussia produced a very unfavorable impression in the interior of France, especially as there was reason to apprehend other defections. Hence, there appeared no alternative but to make a bad peace, or to go on ruining the nation by efforts, the necessity for which would become every day greater, while the evil was increasing and public spirit sensibly decaying. Napoleon, in passing through Dresden, claimed the execution of the promises made by the Emperor of Austria. He required that a movable corps should be employed in Galicia and Transylvania, that the Austrian contingent should be augmented to 60,000 men, and that another minister should be sent to Paris to supply the palace of the Prince of Schwarzenberg, whose presence would be useful in the army. He added, "The alliance which we have contracted forms a permanent system from which our people must derive such important advantages that I am persuaded your majesty will perform all that you promised me at Dresden to secure the triumph of the common cause and speedily bring about a suitable peace." The joy manifested at our disasters had already betrayed the sentiments of Austria, but it was now thought prudent to retract. Monsieur de Bubna was sent off in all haste for Paris and instructed to make the strong professions of friendship. He was to ascertain the ideas of the emperor on the new formation of the contingent and to agree upon the measures necessary for rendering the troops stationed in the provinces adjoining the theater of the war available for services in the field. As to the wish of the emperor to conclude a peace that he had to declare was still more the desire of Austria. Nevertheless, according to the assurances of the ambassador, it was not for the sake of France, whose position Austria knew to be most brilliant, but for Europe and for herself that she desired peace. The progress of Russia, the preponderance which that power was endeavoring to assume, alarmed her, and therefore her political system attached her more closely than ever to France. After our reverses, France, on her part, had also need of repose. Her internal happiness, the happiness of the Empress, affected by the anxieties belonging to a state of war, were considerations which a like interest rendered common to the two sovereigns. Austria, therefore, ardently desired a peace which would place her in the only situation she was ambitious of holding in Europe, and which could not fail to consolidate the power of her ally. If any interference on her part were required, she was ready to undertake it, not pretending, however, to any influence from her own power, but only from the authority which a spirit of conciliation so disinterested as hers might give. The Emperor Napoleon had only to make known his views, and she would endeavor to realize them. He was himself perfectly secure. He alone was able to dictate peace. The only thing necessary was that he should not disclose the too generous basis on which he proposed to negotiate, but to leave the Austrian cabinet to act and to hasten the preparations for a new campaign. The emperor was not duped by these professions, but as there was nothing better to be done, he let the words pass and resorted to his own measures. General Bubna, on his part, did not perfectly accommodate himself to the deceptions his instructions made him so, and which he saw taking root amongst us. He often repeated to those who were disposed to listen to him that peace should be made. He made this observation to me, doubtless, with the view that I should repeat it to the emperor, adding, "Those among you who really love him ought to advise him." Monsieur de Bubna spoke with frankness of a man of honor. He did not understand why he should have any reserve, but the advice he gave was not easily followed. He was in Paris while the great efforts were made by which the army was recreated. He was astonished at seeing such efforts and even entertained some hopes that peace might be obtained. Chapter 8. The winter was spent in military preparation. Some hope was entertained of the Austrian negotiations, but while they were in progress, events were advancing also. The emperor was still in Paris, laboring day and night to augment his resources for the approaching campaign. Before describing the transactions in France, I ought, however, to revert to what had happened in Spain after the Battle of Arapiles. The army commanded by Marshal Suchet, with whom the king had been joined in Valencia by Marshal Soult. They both marched under the orders of the king, first by Madrid and then by the Guadarrama and Arevalo to Salamanca, where they came up with the English army, which had retired from Burgos. On being informed of the advance of these two corps, it was said that on the evening on which they reached Salamanca, they might have engaged the English with advantage, and that they determined to postpone the attack to the following day, but then found that the enemy's army had retreated. It is easy to be wise after events. It does not seem, however, that much reproach can be cast on generals who from prudence do not engage in a serious action at the close of the day, because they wish to avoid the risk of disorder which they might not be able to prevent during the night. After the emperor returned from Russia, he went to Fontainebleau to visit the Pope. They seemed reciprocally pleased with each other. They dined together and settled some points which had not been agreed upon in the negotiations at Savona. The Pope yielded to the emperor's demands, intimating, however, some scruples as to the effect his concessions might have on temporal claims. The emperor satisfied him on that score and even wrote a letter to him for the special purpose of tranquilizing him. The Holy Father appeared quite satisfied, but the old gentleman was crafty. He proposed to consult his council, that is to say, the cardinals, of whose advice he pretended he stood in need. The emperor ordered that they should be sent to him, but they no sooner found themselves at liberty than they filled his holiness's head full of terrors and persuaded him to make exceptions to the Concordat, which he had concluded. He protested and wrote a long letter to the emperor in which he expressed his compunctions and scruples. The emperor, whose patience was worn out, ordered that notwithstanding the absurd disavowal of the Pope, the Concordat should be promulgated and declared a law of the state. The Holy Father was very penurious, notwithstanding that all his wants were amply provided for. He used to count over with great care some dozen pieces of gold which he had in his desk. He kept a strict account of his wardrobe, from his pontifical robes to his shirts, stockings, and the most trifling articles of his dress. He never looked into a book during the whole day, but employed himself in a way which would not be credited had it not been notorious. He patched and stitched up accidental rent in his gown, sewed buttons on his small clothes, and washed the front of his robes to clear them of the stains of snuff, which he took to excess. A large dose of illusion certainly fell to the share of those who could believe in the infallibility of a being in whom the weakness of human nature was so strikingly exemplified. At Fontainebleau he had 1,000 ways of employing his time. He had a splendid library, not a book in which he ever touched. He avoided seeing almost everybody except the cardinals who were restored to him. The emperor was so pressed by events that he could not terminate the business with the Pope before he was obliged to set out for the campaign of 1813. He had brought some of the marshals to Paris in order to give them some repose before they rejoined the army. On dispatching them to take the command of their respective corps, the generosity he displayed towards them was truly magnificent. He gave Marshal Ney 100,000 crowns and Marshal Oudinot 500,000 francs. To the latter, an additional grant was made of 200,000 francs on account of his house at Bar-sur-Ornain being burnt down. At this epoch, General Lecourbe was denounced to the emperor as being engaged in selling his property with the view of entering into the service of Russia. As the information might be well founded, the emperor ordered measures to be taken to prevent the execution of any plan of the kind. On this account, General Lecourbe was sent to Auvergne under the guardianship of the police instead of being allowed to remain in Franche-Comté, where he then was. As a farther precaution, an order was served on General Dutilleux, prohibiting the payment of the price of an estate he had purchased from General Lecourbe. Before commencing the campaign, the emperor sent Monsieur de Narbonne to Vienna as ambassador in the place of Monsieur Otto, who had allowed himself to be a little imposed upon by the professions of Metternich. Unfortunately, when Monsieur de Narbonne arrived, Austria had already resolved to take advantage of our situation to obtain a settlement of the old account she had against us. The combined Russian and Prussian armies were approaching, and our army, having repassed the Elbe, they had entered Dresden, whence the King of Saxony had been obliged to make a hasty retreat. He had come there, as well as his troops in Bohemia, on the pressing solicitations of the Emperor of Austria, who neglected no means to impose upon him and induce him to enter into the coalition against France. The Emperor saw clearly what was going on, and I believe it was chiefly with the view of securing Austria and Saxony that he hastened his departure, in the hope of gaining the favor of fortune. He only regretted that he had not a month longer for preparation to enable him to bring up all the troops which were on their way to the army, in particular the cavalry, a considerable portion of which consisted of drafts from the army of Spain. About this time, orders were given for forming the regiments of cavalry called Guards of Honor, a measure which many efforts were employed to render unpopular. In levying these regiments of young men, there were two objects, which I shall explain. The necessity of obtaining cavalry was admitted. Every man obtainable from the conscription list was taken for the infantry, and besides, the peasantry could not be speedily converted into cavalry. They must have been taught riding and everything necessary in the management of a horse. On the contrary, the class of young men in easy circumstances abounded in good riders who required only to be enrolled to become at once excellent military horsemen. It was very truly observed that the greater part of these young men had already been ransomed by their families for military service, or had otherwise completely satisfied the conscription, but on revising the conscription lists, men who had already passed through the ordeal were again made liable to be drawn. It would then assuredly have been wrong to spare the class most numerous in men fit for military service at a time when the exigency of circumstances rendered injustice unavoidable towards those who were less able to bear a burden, which always presses with great severity on the aged poor, who are dependent on the labor of the younger part of their families. It would doubtless have been very desirable to avoid such a measure, but the impossibility of being otherwise extricated from the difficulty was a sufficient warrant for the government to resort to such means. The measure was, however, a great source of discontent, for each of these youths had a number of relations whose complaints were long and loud, whereas the country people of the laboring classes obeyed the call to join the army without murmuring. These guards of honor might well have been asked how they came to think so much more of themselves than others, as to pretend that they were to stay home when all France was flying to arms. The second object was to withdraw from an idle and unsettled life a numerous class of young men whose ardent spirits made them always ready for hazardous enterprises, and who might become dangerous under the ascendancy of some daring man in possession of their confidence. There was little difficulty in these guards of honor, except in getting them to leave the paternal roof. Once regimented, they acquired the military spirit in perfection. Out of the great number of young men drawn, there were very few defectors. In vain was the cry of tyranny set up. More than 10,000 youths of this class were raised and formed into 4 fine regiments of 2,500 men each. The regiment which was embodied at Tours was the only one which gave any cause for vigilance on the part of the police. I was informed that the young men who composed that regiment had been instigated to mutiny, and that advice of a very criminal kind had been given to them. Monsieur de la Rochefoucauld, who formerly served in La Vendée, was in the habit of appearing frequently at Tours, though his place of residence was at a considerable distance from that town. My information was sufficiently precise to induce me to adopt a decided course. The colonel of this regiment of guards was Monsieur Philippe de Ségur. I wrote to him to arrest 1 or 2 of the young men whom I pointed out to him, and to send them up to Paris. While preparations were making for sending off the prisoners, a little insurrection broke out in the new corps. One of the young men, named Monsieur de Natumier, called upon Monsieur de Ségur and demanded the liberation of his comrades. On meeting a refusal, the youth fired a pistol at his colonel's head. The grains of the powder stuck in Monsieur de Ségur's face, and the ball penetrated his neckcloth, but it did him no other harm. Young Napoleon was sent to Paris along with the other lads whom I had ordered to be arrested. The situation in which he had placed himself was clear, and there appeared no means of saving him. At the bottom, however, he was merely a harebrained youth and quite incapable of deliberately committing a crime. I prosecuted my inquiries as far as I thought necessary. In the meantime, the Duc de Feltre wrote to me several times to deliver up Napoleon to him in order to have him tried by court-martial. It may easily be imagined what would have become of him had I complied. To shelter him from the consequences of this demand of the war minister, I included him in the information I ordered to be drawn up against his comrades. By this means, I kept him in prison, where he remained entirely at my disposal. The events of 1814 occurred, and then the Duc de Feltre would much sooner have given Monsieur de Napoleon the command of a regiment than thought of bringing him before a court-martial. But leaving Paris, the emperor wished to guard against the consequences of a second enterprise such as Malaise. Hitherto, during his absence, the government had resided in the council of ministers, of which the arch-chancellor was present, but a minister might die or be rendered incapable of discharging the duties of his office by sickness, and under such circumstances no person could be authorized to use a signature except by a decree of the emperor. Such a decree, however, might not arrive when he wanted, and it would then happen that whatever was ordered in a particular branch of the administration would be in danger of not being executed. To obviate this inconvenience, he appointed the empress regent and constituted a council for her guidance. He had always present a power capable of delegating whatever authority might be needful for extraordinary occasions. There was much grace in the manner in which he invested the empress with this power. Several days were devoted to the preparation of a plan of regency. The proceedings, which took place at different periods of our history when female regents were at the head of the state, were consulted for precedence. When everything was ready, he convoked a privy council, to which the empress repaired in grand ceremony, accompanied by the great officers of her household, and took her place beside the emperor. After a moment's silence, a decree for appointing a regency and determining its powers was read. The same decree declared that this authority was confirmed by the emperor on the empress. Her majesty then took the oaths to govern the state according to the laws and constitution, and to resign her authority when called upon by the emperor to do so. After the ceremony, her majesty returned to her apartment, accompanied by the emperor. The conferring of this authority on the Empress Maria Louisa was generally approved. Her good and amiable character was well known, and she was consequently much loved and esteemed. Everyone connected with her household had experience of her kindness, and it might with truth be said that she had won the goodwill of the nation, which regarded her with an affectionate respect. For this popularity she was mainly indebted to the propriety of her conduct. She always observed the strictest decorum, and by her deference to public opinion she secured its favor with more certainty than she should have done by the greatest and most successful administrative labors. To assist the empress in this business she had to transact during her regency, the emperor attached to her service a man in whom he had the greatest confidence, his private secretary, Monsieur de Meneval. This was a sacrifice which he imposed on himself, and he directed Monsieur de Meneval to write to him daily. Before leaving Paris, the emperor finally constituted the new paid guard of the capital. As it now exists in the council of ministers, the plan which I had presented for the re-establishing this corps, and in which he had made some alterations, being ready, said, addressing the war minister, "What is your opinion of this, sir?" The minister replied, reddening, "Sire, your majesty is at liberty to do as you please. But with such a plan as this, I have no means of preventing the minister of the police from making himself maire du palais and dethroning your majesty or your son." "Oh," replied the emperor, "that is nonsense. It is not the minister of the police who can do that. He must have the same means of keeping you in check as you wish to have for keeping him so. If this be your only objection to the plan, I do not consider it a valid one." The plan was adopted. I then observed to the minister for the War Department that I should not be the first of the two to forsake the emperor, his son. I then little thought that the truth of my assertion would so speedily be proved. Monsieur de Feltre did not think of what he said, and I cherished but little resentment against him, as will be seen in the following chapter, Chapter 9. About this time, the emperor brought General Dupont to trial for the capitulation of Bayonne. There were implicated in that affair Several generals whom the emperor would have employed had they been otherwise situated besides the investigation of this business had been long pending, and the delay of the trial seemed like a despotic proceeding and a refusal to render justice to the accused. Their rank rendered them amenable only to a high national court, and previous to forming the tribunal, the emperor wished to ascertain whether the accused were really guilty. He did not wish to pronounce an opinion which might be an authority for what anyone might say on the subject. Consequently, he submitted the affair to the examination of a council of state, in which the accused were to be heard in their defense. He added to the council for this occasion only all the marshals of the empire who were at that time in Paris. This trial excited a high degree of public interest. The facts were clear and positive, and though General Dupont's friends had rendered him great service by suppressing in the minutes several documents which might have told against him, yet the consequences of the affair of Belen were so fatal that it could not fail to excite strong dissatisfaction. There is no doubt that had the council of state pronounced the opinion which was derived from the elucidation of the facts, that the accused would have been declared guilty, and consequently exposed to all the severity of a sentence which would have operated as a great example. If the council of state did not decidedly pronounce the guilt of the accused, it could only be because they knew the impossibility of then saving men who had been the comrades of several of its members. If the council referred them to the mercy of the emperor, it was because they were well assured of his indulgence. Otherwise, it would have been equivalent to a condemnation. Accordingly, the emperor did not bring any of the accused parties before the courts. He contented himself with imprisoning General Dupont and depriving him of the honors which had been conferred on him on former occasions. He dismissed from the military service the generals who had taken part in the capitulation of Belen, but he regretted the fate of General Vidal, whom he particularly esteemed for his courage, and whom he intended to have employed after the trial. However, he could not act impartially without this sacrifice. Thus terminated the disgraceful affair of Belen. None but the most bare-faced calumniator will presume to assert that the emperor behaved tyrannically towards generals, all of whom, with the exception of Vidal, had most decidedly failed in their duty. He might be more justly reproached for an indulgence which often degenerated into weakness. He was always ready to pardon. Generosity was one of the predominant sentiments of his heart. I am convinced that he would never have doomed an enemy to death. Was he ever known to avail himself of his fortune in arms in the way in which his enemies employed theirs against him? I will here relate an anecdote concerning Monsieur de Feltre. The seizure of General Dupont's papers gave me the opportunity of seeing several letters from General Clark, Duc de Feltre, to General Dupont. They were all written in Italy and were of very old date. On perusing them, I found that there were reports addressed to Clark, to Dupont, respecting General Bonaparte, after the latter had explained to him the nature of the mission with which he was charged in Italy. It will be recollected that Dupont was at that time chief of the war depot under Director Carnot, and that Clark was under General Dupont, who had given him a commission, which, however, was merely a mask, to reside at the headquarters of the Army of Italy and report the proceedings and plans of General Bonaparte, because no doubt he was suspected of aspiring to the supreme power. It was during this residence in Italy that the letters to which I have alluded were written. He was still acting as an observer of General Bonaparte when the 18th Fructidor overthrew the faction of the Directory to which he was attached, and he lost both favor and employment. However, General Bonaparte, whom he continued to watch, even after explanations between them on the nature of his mission, assisted him, and sheltered him beneath his power when he had only to withdraw his protection in order to ruin him. I had in my possession those letters which completely belie his professions of attachment to the emperor. I might have shown these letters, and thus have ruined the character of the Duc de Feltre. But instead of that, I returned them to him without having mentioned them to anyone. I was unwilling to show any resentment or to diminish the confidence which the emperor reposed in a minister who was useful to him, and who loudly professed the most sincere devotedness to his sovereign.